Welcome to the Not Sari Art Podcast. I'm Sari, the artist and creator behind Not Sari Art. I'm so excited to talk art and creativity with you, so grab a drink, grab a snack, and let's dive in. I also wanted to say that today's episode is sponsored by my book. I have a book coming out. I'm so proud of this, guys. The links are already up. I'll have them in the show notes. But the book is called Modern Still Life, From Fruit Bowls to Disco Balls. It is my take on a step-by-step painting book. I am really excited about it. Not only does it have like motivational tips and tricks to keep you going in your practice, but it also has clear and beautiful and full color breakdowns of the step-by-step process in my paintings. So I could not be more excited about it. If you wanted to check it out, pre-order it. It would help me more than you. Hey y'all, welcome back to the Not Sari Art Podcast. I'm Sari. Thanks for being here. Today's episode is about a concept that I call constraintivity. I'm sure that phrase has been used, and I know the concept has been around forever, but it comes up a lot whenever I work with students or I'm mentoring, and it's the idea that the things that are often our constraints, our limitations, can actually really turn out to be our strengths. I first sort of came to this realization when I started talking about style many years ago. I'm sure you guys have heard, I think I have an episode, if I'm not mistaken, definitely a blog post around something I call the style sandwich about art, where I basically said, like, what makes someone's style, any artist, famous, well-known to humble beginner painter, is your strengths and your weaknesses. And then all of your influences are the filling, like your strengths and your weaknesses are the bun, so to speak. And everyone you've ever been creatively inspired by is the filling. And you never experience an artist just as their strengths and just as their weaknesses and just as their inspirations, that it sort of melds together flavor-wise, if that makes any sense. And it got me thinking about the importance and the power of reframing our own weaknesses and limitations, and to some degree external weaknesses and limitations, as kindling for creative sparks. Before I jump into this episode, I want to make a slight editor's note. I know I've talked about this on other podcasts. Like, you can't always control everyone you're speaking to. And I just want to say, if you're someone who's very legitimately up against limitations that are completely enabling, keep preventing you from making art or doing something in your life, this is not the message for you. I would say, like with any message, good advice can eventually turn into bad advice. And I do think that there are people, maybe even people who are listening to this episode, who are in a place where they need help, and simply reframing their limitations is not only callous, but downright unkind. And so if you feel like you're in that camp, protect your energy. I'll check in with you next week. But I really do, with this episode, kind of want to give some examples and cheer you on. And I don't know, and hopefully help you find some peace with your own limits, whatever they may be, and challenge the way you think of it in order to help foster and cultivate new things, new growth. Okay, all that to say, let's just dive into the episode. So recently I've been working on a body of work that has had me, it's a body of work that I've kind of kept off of social media until the launch. It's my disco balls. And during this time while I was working on them, I didn't have the dopamine of being able to post about it, which good, bad, whatever, probably something in the middle, is a not insignificant part of how I stay motivated to make artwork. There is always an 8-year-old inside of me that just wants to show everyone my artwork. It's not quite that cut and dry, but it's not that. Anyways, and so working on a body of work where I have to go through multiple paintings and not have that gratitude means that I have to kind of go into manual mode when it comes to motivating myself. I very much need novelty and dopamine to get, I'm using those words incorrectly. Again, I'm very much not a pop psychologist, right? Anyways, but so one of the ways I normally get through that is I will go on a deep dive of some random thing. And for right now, I have been on a hugely deep Pink Floyd deep dive. Don't ask me why. I've listened to all the interviews and it's just got me incredibly motivated. I won't talk more about it other than to say, just know that whenever I have to go trudge on a painting for hours and hours and hours, getting a playlist of not only their music, but deep cut interviews has been motivating me. So if you needed a tip, if you're also someone who can only sustain themselves motivation wise on dopamine and novelty, like find something that you want to deep dive on and like save it for when you're painting or working or whatever it is. Anyways, okay, so all that to say, on this deep dive, Pink Floyd has an interesting career. I won't go too into the weeds, but they had a founding member and he had a mental health crisis, and so he stepped away from the band. And this founding member was like the lead creative force in this band. The lead singer, lead guitarist, writer, everything, right? And when he left the band, stepped away, it's disputed exactly how that went down. There were 3 remaining band members, and they got a guitarist in, and they had some albums that were very like experimental because they were kind of refinding their way. They still had band members who were incredibly driven and ambitious, but they like had to kind of refine their style. And what was interesting about this is usually, generally speaking, when you're a creative, you find your style within the context of relative obscurity, which I would say is a good thing. For me, it is. And because they had already been signed and they had put some money behind them and they had had relative success with some of their first albums, I mean, I think pretty big success with their first one, there was a lot more pressure and a lot more eyes on them and a lot more need for them to figure it out kind of quickly. And I think that this is really, and as someone who like not only is on this like random Pink Floyd deep dive, but like loves trajectories of people's bands' creativity, I was like super interested in this story. And so they had a season where they did really, really experimental music, like just albums with things made of found sounds, animal sounds. Everyone on the album produced their whole entire quadrant of the album, like just really, truly wacky, out of the wall stuff. And what was interesting is during this period, they were kind of floundering. Everyone always makes these documentaries and these interviews you see in hindsight, and everyone kind of romanticizes things. But if you're on a deep dive level of the caliber that I was, and I mean like truly like the most obscure, cruddy, like French translated interviews from like 1971. Anyways, if you look back and read the tea leaves a little bit, kind of what was happening is they weren't getting they were able to still make albums, but they were getting thrown other jobs as they were trying to find their new sound. They had a pretty loyal fan base, and that's, I think, why they were able to still produce albums. But I think floundering feels like at times an appropriate word. And so because of this, and because they were sort of like these artsy sound experiments, kind of quasi-psychedelic, this group of musicians, they were thrown several soundtracks that they worked on. And a couple of their albums are actually just like soundtracks for other movies. What ended up happening is that they started their experimental sound, that they had some things the whole time that were little threads between them, but they went from being this wildly disjointed and experimental band with certain themes to all of a sudden, after they did these soundtracks, they started gravitating towards music that had themes all the way throughout, like a soundtrack. And I think part of why they were doing this soundtrack was because, again, they were kind of floundering. I don't know their finances. I don't know if they were running out of money. I don't know if the record label was like, in order to keep payrolling these experimental albums, you have to do these. I don't know what it was. They stopped doing them. And in an interview of David Gilmour in, I think, 1987 or something, he basically said, someone called in on a radio station, was like, why don't you do soundtracks anymore? I really liked more or whatever. And he basically said, I don't, because I don't have to, which again, we're generalizing a little bit, but the subtext there is like, they no longer had to do it. I bring all of this up, if I haven't lost you at this point, because it makes so much sense if you like their discography, that part of doing soundtracks led them to the sound they had. Now, concept albums were a thing after Sgt. Pepper. I mean, you probably could find examples other than Sgt. Pepper and before Sgt. Pepper, but under the sort of hegemonic, white British male musician lens, they were the first to do it in that sort of tradition. Pink Floyd was kind of one of the first bands to have such a cohesive, like one song into another, and not only a concept, but the music flowed kind of like a soundtrack. Like you'd have songs call back to other songs at the beginning. There'd be an underscore that went, I'm not using the right music terms. If you're a music person and listening to this and cringing, apologies. But basically, like the musical part would echo another part, and certain songs would, in the same way that a soundtrack sort of speaks to itself. And you'll hear the same music either in an orchestral moment at one point, and then it'll be a guitar riff at one point, in this very incredibly cohesive way that soundtracks often have to be. Okay, why am I saying all this? I'm saying this because Pink Floyd wouldn't have been who they are if it hadn't been for that slumpy period in the middle where, yes, they got to experiment, and yes, they got to keep making art. And I would argue, as someone who thinks that everyone should have access to art, and I darn near think it's a right at this point, which don't come for me, but I also think their constraints were part of what made them who they are. And I see this, I know this from myself. And the thing is, I'm always hesitant to make episodes purely around my own anecdotes, right? Because I don't know, it feels very navel-gazy and like it's anecdotal evidence. However, this is something that I've seen in other artists who I enjoy across industries. I've seen this in my students, and some of my favorite art when I go and listen to interviews with these artists, whether they're musicians or painters or writers, so much of their strength and ingenuity comes from a constraint that was unique to them. In fact, there's a famous quote by Orson Welles who says, "The enemy of art is the absence of limitations." And getting back to music here for a moment, this has been my long-standing theory for a while as to why so many artists tend to have sophomore slumps. There's a theory that on your first album, it's years and years, if not decades, of your best work that you get to put on a first album. And then you kind of have to start over for a sophomore. So there's that too, and probably that's most of it. But I have always sort of thought that a lot of times what happens is if you have a first album that's a success, the reason that the follow-up is so hard is because you're then given the best producers and the best sound mixing and the best equipment and time and all of these things that felt like limitations. And I'm not saying that those things can't be helpful, but I think unless you're an artist who also knows how to impose your own limitations, which good artists do, I'll give you guys some examples in a second, that can lead to sort of almost like an analysis paralysis, so to speak, and that there's a lot of importance in having something to sort of like metaphorically push up against. I remember in a writing class one time hearing a teacher say that like limitation can be really helpful. In fact, I think there's an Ernest Hemingway quote that's like, a good writer should be able to tell a story in just 6 words, which feels crazy, but then the example is for sale, baby shoes never worn, which, that's such a, it's really, that's really powerful. It's just 6 words, and yet you can evoke emotion with just those 6 words, and how there's really power in any kind of limitation. And I know there's one thing that I've said with people I've heard, but it's, we often think about like, who's the first person to drink milk, or who's the first person to try mushrooms, or, whatever it is. And yes, there's probably just like curiosity is like a huge part of it. But I often think that it was probably like intense hunger. Like people probably, not to say this is a good thing, by the way, this is not I think limitations, that inflict on people's basic needs and humanity are good. We're not, Ayn Randing it up in here. No, what I'm saying though, is that I think it's part of most human creativity is born out of a certain amount of, I think, like support and open like time, and also your limitations. And I'll reference back to the top of the show where I talk a little bit about style and how your own skill can feel like a limitation. I was just talking to someone today about your artist statement and even just like being an artist in and of itself, how so often what will happen is we'll get better. We'll say, okay, I'll be happier, or I'll be at a better spot. I'll be a real artist, the ever evasive, I'll be a real artist. Whenever I get better at drawing, or I get better at values, or I get better at this, whatever, insert skill. And you whether you get there or not, let's say you do move towards that and you do get to a point where you look back and you know that the 2 years ago version of you would have been thrilled with your ability. The thing is, you, as a creative person, there's always a dance between the part of you. Sometimes she gets called a perfectionist. I think that it's not just, I think we have a part of us that's like a taste maker, right? It's our taste. I've heard it just called that. It's our taste. And that is always going to improve and become more sophisticated. And you're the more you have skill, the more you're able to look at other artists' work with that particular skill. And then you see that what they're doing with that skill, and you just keep moving the bar. And so, I think the idea that like, I will be happy when I no longer have this limitation of my own skills and ability can really be a hindrance to finding a certain amount of peace. And I don't mean like not pushing or not growing or not changing how you paint, but I mean that ever evasive, like I will be real once I get past this hurdle. And instead learning to sort of embrace perhaps some of those limitations. I always quote an example of someone who I think their limitations, and I'm using that, and now we're using, it's funny because like once you apply the word limitation to someone who's like a acclaimed sort of artist who like everyone can agree is like a really good artist, you don't even want to use the word limitation. And I think that's a really good insight because like, why are we okay if we're newer, younger artists to be like, oh, I can't draw, I'm not a real artist because I can't draw very well, or, whatever. But the minute we see a painter like Alice Neal, who I love, I adore. I actually really like Alice Neal's work and the way she's able to capture likeness, despite not having the most like traditional, like academic, like understanding of anatomy. I mean, she perhaps does understand it, but she chooses not to go that route. And I think it's funny because whether she knows how to paint academically and then doesn't or not, doesn't matter. Like it shouldn't affect the viewer's experience of the art. Sometimes it's funny because like when I talk to people who are like not in the art world, they know of art, but and that's fine. That's a morally neutral statement. But, they'll say, well, I understand that, I like realistic looking paintings. That's like something that, and I get it. I think there's a conversation there around skill and class and labor, and I'll one day perhaps, but I'll mention someone like a Picasso and they'll say, well, I actually think I respect him at least, or something like this. I'm paraphrasing because like he used to be really good. Like he was classically trained and then he chose not to. And it's funny because like when your limitations are sort of presented as though you had a choice in the matter of like, you could have drawn perfectly, but you chose to not, all of a sudden that choice is sort of exalted in a way that I can't help. I think what people are getting at is it's like doing the best and having control over how your art is presented. And I think that is a more interpersonal journey than I think we even know to some extent. So getting back to Alice Neal, whether or not she could paint and chose not to paint, perfectly representationally, it doesn't matter because what makes her work hers is that she paints it like Alice Neal. And I bring this up a lot to students who are like, they'll come to me and they'll be like, I want to get really good at drawing. And I'm like, yes, let's do it. There's lots of skills. There's a really good book called Drawing on the Right Side of Your Brain, which by the way, if you want to get good at drawing and you don't want this to be your particular limitation, there are resources. I'm not saying don't improve, don't get better. I'm actually asking you to explore creatively, why do you want to get better? And is that helping with your creativity or your ego? Who knows? I don't know. I don't know the answer for everyone. It's going to be unique, but I want to keep people from feeling like they have to beeline towards a certain level of skill and a certain look of skill in order to be a quote, real artist or taken seriously. But if you allow yourself to sort of question and figure out for yourself if that's something you want to explore, it gives you the power back. And I think that's the important thing to take away. Okay, Sari, that wasn't helpful. You just told me I could get better at drawing, but I don't have to. I'm just saying whether or not how you choose to evolve your skill should be a choice made out of creativity and not the compulsive need to look like what someone else's version of an artist is. That's the takeaway. And the last thing I'll just say is, I think about this in regards to myself. And I want to be careful here because I have a pretty, I'm really careful with taking the insights and lessons that I gleaned from a childhood of extreme scarcity, growing up below the poverty line, with parents who struggled with addiction and a part of the country that was very, it was a tough could be a tough at times place to grow up with, that I never want to have someone ever listen to my story and be like, oh, well, I'm glad you went through poverty because you learned all these great lessons. So let me just, when I go into this, I want to say I wholeheartedly am opposed to creating these kinds of living conditions for any human. I think a lot of, I was very fortunate that I was able to get quite a bit of government assistance that kept us from truly being in really desperate situations. But that being said, this is not me condoning extreme levels of scarcity for anyone, and particularly children. This is just me sharing some insight. But I can remember as a kid learning the superpower that is creativity, because I was constantly having to creative my way out of pretty scarce moments, whether that was like, I'm not going to get into details, but like grim food concoctions out of mostly condiments in the kitchen, watching my mom and dad have to be incredibly creative with things. But one thing that I think atrophies our culture, and obviously not everyone, because not everyone could participate in this level of capitalism, is the idea that we cut ourselves off from our own creativity because we assume that the solution to all of our limitations can be bought or sort of capitalismed away. Okay, that's a horrible phrase. But what I mean by that is capitalism often, our current state of capitalism often sort of offers us as like the problem to all of our solution can be bought away. When I actually think that most of the time, the problem to our solution should be creativity away and community away. Okay, I'm not even speaking English anymore. But I think the fact that it offers a solution that doesn't require us to participate in the give and take of community in order to have a solution, and also the labor that is creativity. Creativity is magical, but it's work. It's hard work. It's it doesn't often get respected. I feel like, I know I've said this before, but often a lot of the population thinks that creative labor is an oxymoron, but in reality, we know because we look at what the top 1% value and what, has always been valued. Maybe not the laborer, but like the creative labor is always something that's been culturally valued. The product of creative labor is always something that's been valued, whether or not the producer of the creative labor has been valued or not. But when we sort of take away the crutch that is, I'll just buy my way out of all of these hard situations, I don't feel like I have personal style or I don't have a creative outlet. How about I just go and buy, mob wife aesthetic every, what is it, lake grandpa aesthetic? I can't keep up with it. But instead of sort of purchasing our way out of those holes, we could creative our way out of it. One of the things that comes to mind, something that's like not quite so like sad and solemn, is like with my fashion choices, specifically in middle school and high school. So, this was during a time period, and I'm totally going to like date myself here, but where the thing to wear with almost little to no exception was a branded like Abercrombie, Aeropostale, Hollister shirt with the big branding text across it, and then very branded clothes from those stores. Like maybe you could kind of do the seam thing, but it was very like, you still mostly had to do like hot topic, bracketed belts and stuff. I remember having enough self-awareness to be like, it feels like this might be a particularly rough time to be a thrift shop exclusive kid, because during this time I remember the only like name brands that were in the only name brands that were in thrift stores was like late 90s, early 2000s Tommy Hilfiger. And I tried wearing that, and I remember getting clocked. And it's not that I was trying. It's funny because in middle school, now I look back, I'm like, who are you trying to fool? Like, you're poor, just like be clean and don't worry. But when you're a kid, you're just so focused on like just fitting in. And so I can remember my solution to this was just to really lean into as much fashion as I could. And so I can remember, kids being like, wow, you really like the 60s and 70s, don't you? Because I did kind of dress like that. And it's funny because like I remember being like, no, I don't. And be like, oh yeah, like I am wearing those kinds of clothes. But what I remember doing as a kid is I studied fashion magazines. So my mom had a friend who would always give me like magazines that were like 3, 5, 6 months old. And I would look at those. Luckily we were in the Ozarks. So that's, that was still very on trend for us. And it was a slower trend cycle. But I remember, it was like that 70s show was really popular. and I would learn like what was in and what to pair with what, and I would find it at thrift stores, and I would sew, and like nothing crazy, like just like hand stitch, but things to be cuter or to fit a little better, or patches, or whatever, to kind of make what I was wearing cuter. And so it seemed like an intentional creative statement, like I was choosing to be kind of retro. It did help that I liked music from the 60s and 70s, but anyways, and I remember it sort of gave, like, finding, by plugging into creativity, it was a light bulb moment that it gave me back a little bit of like humanity and autonomy, and the perception that there was like choice in my limitation to some degree. And I remember that, amongst of course many, many, many other things, I could fill an entire book, sort of taught me that there's magic in creativity. There's magic in the power of, like, if I put my mind to something and choose to be creative, that I can turn my limitation into, I mean, at the time I probably would have told you something survivable, but I look back in hindsight and all of the lessons I learned about silhouette and fabric and texture and color theory, and like, I can remember so distinctly my mom saying, like, look at these plaid bell bottoms that you want to buy. Like, do you see how there's this thread of this mustard yellow and this navy blue? Find a shirt that has that in it, and then pull that in with like a shawl that has this other color, and having solids and patterns, and like all of these things I learned that felt like surviving my limitations. Or like, surviving is a strong word, but I will say high school and middle school fashion, just anyways, now to me look like lessons and look like things that I treasure about myself and my own creative expression. I'm currently working on an outline for a course about finding your style, and one of the units is all about this concept, constraintivity, and the intentional putting of limitations on yourself in order to find your style. Because the more limitations you're handed, in context to like creativity, the more you're forced to see more of yourself. You're forced to use more of your own sort of instincts and creativity. And it really is like strengthening a muscle, especially in a world where that creativity is often atrophied, because you can buy your way out of discomfort. You can buy your way out of not having community. You can buy your way out of lacking creativity. However you want to interpret this, whether you're going to go back to your studio and paint and like put limitations on your color palette or your subject or your style or your brushes or whatever that manifests for you, or if you take this concept and apply it kind of at a larger scale, I just wanted to say creativity is magic, and limitations can be invites into seeing a version of yourself that you would have never pushed through had you had all of the options. So anyways, all that to say, thank you for listening. Hopefully some of that was helpful. I would love to hear how your constraints, any of them, whether it's art or otherwise, have led to your biggest breakthrough, creativity, learning about yourself even moments. I know they're there. I know because every time I work with someone and I, more personally, and I find out about who they are, these creative people, I find out that they have these big displays of like they had to work through something, and that's how they anchored themselves and identified with their creativity. And it's always magical to see. So thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the episode, make sure to leave a review. They're always really helpful. Take care. Happy creating. And I'll talk to you guys next week. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you for being here. I wanted to also encourage you guys to leave a review. The feedback is incredibly helpful, and if you leave a review, I will read your handle or your name on the following week's episode. Take care, y'all, and happy creating.